January 3rd, 1942. Berlin, Germany. The grand chandelier above flickered slightly, casting a cold, indifferent light across the room. The hum of conversation, murmured in clipped German accents, drowned out the faint clinking of glasses and the shuffle of polished boots across the parquet floor. The officers, men of power, men of control, seated themselves around the high wooden tables, their faces expressionless, their eyes distant. This was not a place for warmth, not a place for humanity. In the corner, bathed in the harsh glare of the overhead lamps, sat the pianist. His fingers, nimble but deliberate, hovered over the ivory keys of the grand piano. The notes that slipped from his hands were soft, almost detached, like whispers caught in the wind. He was a man who had learned to disappear, to melt into the background, to become the furniture of the room. The officers didn't notice him much. Not really. To them, he was just another cog in the machine, a musician who played for their amusement. A background figure, a distraction in a time of war. But beneath the music, something much darker was happening. Each note he played was a secret, each piece of music a coded message. A subtle shuffle of fingers, a brief hesitation, a slight touch of the pedal. It was all part of the plan. The pianist had long since abandoned the simple notion of playing for enjoyment. He was playing for survival now. His role, in the quiet war being waged in the shadows, was not just to entertain, but to relay information, small signals, easily overlooked, that could change the course of lives. But survival, in such a place, was not a simple thing. He had learned that lesson early on. His eyes scanned the room, carefully observing the officers who lounged around the tables, nursing their drinks. Their arrogance was as thick as the smoke curling up from the cigars in their hands. They talked with confidence, with the surety of men who believed they were untouchable. They were the very face of the regime, and yet they were blind to the small man sitting just a few feet away, whose music would be their undoing. The pianist played on, lost in the rhythm of the moment, each note carefully placed like a bead on a string. His mind was not on the music itself, not on the melody he was creating. No, his focus was elsewhere. It was on the man sitting near the back, his uniform sharply pressed, his hand resting casually on the edge of his glass. The officer's eyes occasionally drifted to the pianist, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than was necessary. And when it did, the pianist's fingers tensed slightly. He had learned to read the signs, the small, almost imperceptible movements that indicated something was about to shift. The officer, his name was Weiss, a high-ranking official in the Gestapo. Weiss had been coming to the performances for weeks, and the pianist had begun to suspect that the officer's interest in him wasn't purely musical. It wasn't just the usual entertainment that brought Weiss here. There was something else. A flicker of tension passed through the pianist's chest, but his fingers never missed a beat. He had to stay calm. He couldn't afford to slip up. Weiss shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the piano. There was again the tiny shift of focus, the tilt of the head, the narrowing of the pupils. The pianist, in that moment, knew the game had changed. The music built, but the notes grew sharper, more deliberate. His fingers glided over the keys, the patterns now resembling more than just a melody. They had become a signal, a system, a code. It wasn't just Weiss who had caught on. The pianist's true audience was hidden in plain sight. The resistance, the people who operated in the cracks of society, had understood the messages from the very beginning. And it was these silent exchanges, concealed in the delicate language of music, that allowed the resistance to thrive. But for the pianist, the stakes were personal. His life, hanging by a thread, depended on his ability to send these messages without being detected. One wrong note, one misstep, and everything would unravel. The officers around the table would realize that the pianist was not who they thought he was, not just a servant, not just an entertainer. They would discover that he had been playing a far more dangerous game all along. There was a sound of shuffling feet as an officer rose from his seat. The pianist's heart skipped. Weiss was coming toward him. The officer's boots echoed loudly in the silence. The pianist's hands froze on the keys for a fraction of a second. then resumed playing, his fingers almost mechanically following the familiar pattern. He couldn't stop now, not when everything was riding on the performance. Why stop just behind him, standing close enough to feel the heat from the pianist's body? The air seemed to thicken as the officer leaned in, his breath faint against the pianist's ear. He could hear Weiss's voice, low and purposeful. "You've been playing for us for weeks, haven't you?" Weiss said, a note of something dangerous creeping into his tone. "I wonder if your music carries more than just entertainment." The pianist's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression steady, his eyes on the keys. He couldn't afford to look up, not even now. A glance, a twitch of the eye, could betray him. "I play as I am told," the pianist replied quietly, his voice betraying nothing. Nothing more. Weiss didn't move away. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the pianist's music, soft, steady, calculated. The officer's presence lingered like a shadow, a weight pressing against him. And yet, in the midst of the tension, the pianist continued. It was a dangerous dance, the tension between him and Weiss building with each passing moment. Suddenly, Weiss leaned in even closer, his hand resting lightly on the back of the pianist's chair. "We shall see," the officer whispered. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the pianist with the haunting echo of his words ringing in the air. The room, once filled with the carefree chatter of officers, now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The pianist's heart pounded in his chest, his fingers barely able to keep up with the rhythm. But his mind was clear, as it always had to be. He had played his part for now, but the real danger was still to come. March 17th, 1943. Warsaw, Poland. The air in the cramped basement was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to settle on your shoulders, pressing down with the weight of knowing something was coming, but not knowing exactly what. The faint, rhythmic sound of a train rattling somewhere in the distance barely reached the room, a reminder of the war raging just beyond the city's walls. Yet in this small, dimly lit space, time felt as though it had stopped, suspended in the limbo of resistance. At a worn wooden table, a group of men and women sat huddled together, their voices hushed, their faces tired but determined. They were the heart of the Warsaw Resistance, a collective of unlikely heroes who had dared to defy the Gestapo, knowing that every day could be their last. The pianist, who had so long blended into the background, was now very much at the center of it all. His role had grown far beyond that of a mere entertainer. He had become a crucial link in the Resistance's covert operations. The piano, which once stood in the corner of a room full of Nazi officers, now sat in the center of the room, an unexpected tool in the Resistance's arsenal. In this place, there were no polite officers listening to music for leisure. Here, every note was a lifeline, each chord carefully constructed to carry a hidden message, a coded communication for those in the know. The pianist, his fingers trembling slightly from the weight of his new responsibility, prepared for another night of silent rebellion. The group around the table looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. They had all heard the rumors, the whispers of his music that had reached the underground network, stories of how he had played for the officers, passing information to the right people through his music, sometimes barely audible to the untrained ear. But there was no time to bask in such small victories. The war was not waiting, and neither were the Nazis. One of the resistance leaders, a woman named Eva, leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pianist's face for any sign of doubt. She had seen many break under pressure, seen many fold when the stakes became too high. But there was something in the pianist's eyes, something unyielding, something that told her he would not falter, not yet. His dedication to their cause had only grown stronger over time. "We have to get the message to the others tonight," Eva said, her voice low but firm. "The Gestapo is tightening its grip on the city. If we don't act soon, it'll be too late." The pianist nodded, his mind already shifting gears, the mental map of his music becoming clearer in his mind. Every piece of music he played had to be calculated, every note, every pause, every shift in rhythm. It wasn't just about the melody anymore. It was about sending hidden instructions, telling the resistance when and where to move, how to avoid the Nazi patrols, and where to strike next. A man named Andre, who sat next to Eva, glanced nervously at the pianist. He was younger than the others, his face still holding traces of the boy he had once been before the war had stolen so much from him. He had known fear in its rawest form. He had seen his family dragged away, heard the screams of those who had fought and failed. The pianist had never been one to show much emotion, always keeping his feelings locked behind his eyes, but Andre could sense the weight of his burden. "The officers are more suspicious now," Andre said, his voice a little shaky. "Do you think you can keep doing this?" The slightest mistake, and the pianist raised his hand, silencing the young man. He understood the fear. He felt it too, but there was no turning back. They had all come this far, each of them risking their lives for a single moment of defiance, for a shot at changing the future. The pianist could already see the paths forming in his mind, the subtle rhythms of danger and escape, the delicate balance of communication hidden in plain sight. "I can do it," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "I know what's at stake." Eva looked at him, her expression unreadable. She knew that the pianist had become more than just a link in their communication network. He had become the soul of their resistance. His music had done more than just relay information. It had lifted spirits, reminded people of something worth fighting for. His songs had become anthems in the darkest corners of Warsaw. There was a long pause before Eva spoke again. "The message will be hidden in tonight's performance. It's crucial that the timing is perfect. You'll play for them, but you'll play for us too. Every note will matter." The pianist nodded, his fingers resting lightly on the keys in front of him. It was always the same. The music, the codes, the hidden messages. But tonight, there was something else, a sense of finality, the feeling that the war was reaching its breaking point. Every note, every movement would carry the weight of what could be the last opportunity to strike. The officers would be there, of course. They would sit and laugh, unaware of the significance of the music. They would talk amongst themselves, their voices low, their hands raised in mock applause, pretending to appreciate the pianist's skill. But they would never see what was happening beneath the surface. They would never hear the coded patterns in the music that told the resistance when to move, where to strike, how to survive. The pianist had learned to master the art of misdirection. The officers watched him, but their attention was always just a little too focused on the wrong thing. They were consumed by the music, by the illusion of peace and entertainment, while the real war was being waged in the silent pauses between his notes. The performance began that evening, the quiet, somber chords slipping from his fingers, a deliberate prelude to the coded message hidden within. His fingers moved with precision, not a single note wasted, not a single beat skipped. As the music flowed, so too did the message, each phrase a key, each shift in rhythm a signal. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, but he didn't look up. He couldn't afford to. Andre, Eva, and the others had been given their instructions. The paths were set, the codes delivered, but now it was up to them. It was a dangerous game they played, but the pianist had no choice. His music had become their voice. Their hopes, their futures, all depended on the precision of these hidden signals. As the final notes lingered in the air, the pianist allowed himself a brief moment of respite, the weight of the performance lifting just slightly from his shoulders. But there was no time for celebration. The moment had passed, and now he would have to wait, just like all the others, for the message to reach its destination and for the true battle to begin. November 8th, 1944. Prague, Czechoslovakia. The cold winds of winter had already begun to sweep through the cobblestone streets of Prague, leaving a bitter chill in the air that cut through to the bones. The war was drawing to a close, but the city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, for the final turn of the tide. Inside a small, dimly lit apartment, far from the sounds of the front lines, the pianist sat alone, his back to the window, his fingers resting on the worn-out keys of an old, upright piano. He had played this piano countless times before, though the music had long since stopped being about the music. Tonight, the notes he played would carry no hidden messages. There were no coded signals to be passed under the white and black keys, no resistance networks waiting to decipher his every move. This was the end. A final performance, if you could call it that. A farewell to the world of shadows, to the life he had led in the margins of history. He hadn't spoken to Eva or Andre in months. The resistance was falling apart, its network shattered by betrayals, by the Gestapo's relentless hunt. Many had been captured. Many more had been silenced forever. The pianist had survived, but the cost had been immense. And now, even with the war nearly over, there was nothing left to fight for. The heroes of the resistance were fading into memory, their names swallowed by the noise of history's more celebrated victories. They had given everything, and yet they would be forgotten. His fingers moved hesitantly across the keys. He was supposed to perform again tonight, a final concert arranged by the Allies as a symbolic gesture of unity, a moment of triumph. But what was the point? The war was ending, but the piano he played was no longer an instrument of rebellion. It was simply a relic of a forgotten past, an artifact from a world that had already moved on. The pianist had always understood the power of music, the way it could touch the human soul, even when words failed. He had seen in the faces of the men and women he had played for, the soldiers, the resistance fighters, the officers who thought they could control him. Music, for them, had always been a fleeting escape, a brief moment of peace in the chaos of war. But for him, it had been something different. It had been a weapon, a shield, a way of speaking the truth when no one else dared. As the hours stretched on, the pianist's thoughts wandered back to the days when he had first begun playing for the officers, when the music had been a quiet rebellion, a subtle way of sending messages to those who needed them most. He had been just a man at the piano then, a man caught between two worlds, the world of the enemy and the world of those who had resisted them. But now, as the war neared its end, he felt as though he were standing on the edge of something deeper, something darker. The quiet erasure of all that they had done. The door to the apartment creaked open, breaking his reverie. Eva stepped inside, her face drawn and weary. Her eyes met his, but there was no warmth there, only the cold recognition of something irrevocable. "They're coming," she said softly. "The Allies. The war is ending." The pianist nodded, but he didn't look up. He couldn't bring himself to face her. Not after everything they had been through. Not after all the sacrifices, the betrayals, the lives lost. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," Eva continued, her voice wavering with the weight of her words. "You kept us alive, kept the messages flowing when it seemed like everything was falling apart." He let out a breath, but there was no relief in it. And for what? For this? A final performance, for what? A victory that's been paid for with blood and silence? Eva's eyes hardened. "You know why it matters? The war is over. The resistance won, but we don't get to choose how history remembers us." He finally turned to face her. Her face was lined with age and hardship, her eyes tired but fierce. "I didn't fight for recognition. I fought because it was the only thing left to do." She stepped closer, her gaze softening for a moment. "But you still deserve to be remembered." "You remembered?" He laughed bitterly. "For what? For playing a few notes while the world burned around us? For passing secrets under a piano while men danced to their own doom?" Eva didn't respond, her gaze falling to the floor, the weight of his words settling in between them. There were no more words to be said. The war had ended, and the world would move on. The heroes of the resistance would fade into the background, their names erased by the passing years. The pianist would be forgotten. His music, once so vital, would become a distant echo.